And wear glasses.
I better hold on.
No, I need to look cool, you know, in this hot climate. Just give me a moment. I have a few things here that I hope I brought. I notice that everybody carries these shopping bags.
Yeah.
There are 4 or 5 of them outside, so I asked Fred to make certain that this one stayed here and was not replaced by another. I'm not quite sure how to begin, or how to continue, or how to end. Never am. I might read perhaps 1 or 2 short passages from the book, just to give you a kind of preliminary taste of what I'm attempting to do here. Joseph is correct, absolutely correct. I have very little scientific training or background. Consists of taking several math courses in university and contemplating for some time whether I should become a mathematician or go on, as my mentor Louis Dudek said, and try and become a poet. These 2 disciplines seemed to me then to be in contradistinction to one another. You couldn't be a poet and a mathematician, or you couldn't be a mathematician and a poet at the same time. Of course, later on I learned that one of the great poets, Omar Khayyam, who gave us a poem that stayed with us for the centuries, was also the inventor of algebra. And more recently I discovered that some very famous French poets were also first-class, top-tier mathematicians. I'm thinking in particular of Paul Valéry, who is not only one of the great poets of the 20th century, but also one of its top mathematicians. So ultimately, there perhaps is no conflict between math and poetry, and in fact poetry is a very formal discipline if you're serious about it, and math is a very imaginative discipline as well. So there is that kind of harmonious or compatible marriage between math and poetry, and I did a lot of math in university. But that was a long time ago. So for the scientific authentication of whatever of my thesis in this book, I was very fortunate to be able to consult one of the top young scientists in Canada, who happens to be my son. He's a professor at the University of Alberta. He runs his own lab. He has several patents pending. He's been in Nature. His essays and his research work has been in Nature, in Science, and other very prestigious scientific magazines. And when I began researching, this was about 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, the global warming phenomenon. I'll say a little bit more about this in a short time. I was very suspicious of the mathematics that I was looking at, and the graphs, of course. For example, Michael Mann's famous hockey stick, rising blade, indicating that according to the graph, you see, it wasn't a hockey stick, it was a graph. There were 2 of these, and perhaps you've seen them. And he was charting the variations in climate and in temperature over the 20th century, and what you saw, and a little bit before that, what you saw were the various points indicating temperature nodules, so to speak, and then suddenly, in our planet, there's a sudden rise, sudden vertical shaft rising from a more or less reasonably horizontal plane. And that was supposed to signify the fact that we are now in the midst of global warming, that this is catastrophic, that we are now in the last 10 years of the 20th century, we're the hottest decade on record in modern history, and so on. I was very suspicious of that because, you know, I was around before the last decade of the 20th century, and it seemed to me that I remembered some hotter years than the years in which Michael Mann informed me were the most, calorific on record. So I had my son, who was also nominated as the foremost young scientist in Canada, look at the math and at the graphs. And what was interesting was that he was global warming at that point. This was not his area of expertise. He is a nanotechnologist, and he's investigating ways of creating communication networks that are no bigger than a molecule. But he had accepted the so-called fraudulent consensus that global warming was in fact something that we could not be denied, and anybody who denied it was called a denier and therefore was a heretic and so on. And he really believed in that. So I asked him to do the research for me because I didn't know enough math to really get behind what I had seen on the graphs and in the computer models and so on, though as I said, I was intensely suspicious. He spent 2 months doing the research for me because he was my son and we're very close to one another. And after that period, he wrote me and said, "You know what, David, you're entirely right. The math is bogus. The graphs are fraudulent. The computer models are corrupt." And now he is anti-global warming, so to speak. He has become a denier, a heretic, and is probably in danger of losing his status within his department, despite the awards he has won, because everybody there is of the left, and we know that global warming, we should know that the global warming hysteria these days is really a product of left-wing thinking, and there's a reason for this, which we'll probably get into a little later. So when I have been accused by many people, actually, of not knowing what I'm talking about because I just happen to be a poet, presumably, and poets are supposed to be, you know, very wayward creatures who really know nothing about anything except how to put rhymes together. And even in today's climate, so to speak, intellectual climate, poets don't even know how to put rhymes together anymore. A poet cannot be taken seriously. I didn't present myself when I wrote this book as a poet, simply as a concerned citizen. So when I was asked by some people what my real source of authority was, it occurred to me that perhaps I should reveal a little secret, because it isn't only that I have a highly intelligent son who could do some research for me, and that I myself was skeptical by nature and so on, but I had to consult an apocalyptic authority, an authority that no one could ever deny, and the authority is right here. See, it's a crystal ball, which I bought at a mystical shop, it's called, on Queen Mary Street in Montreal, when I was really concerned about whether I had the chutzpah as well as the background authority to make the claims that I have made in my book. So I bought this crystal ball, and I consulted it one evening, and I followed the recipe that had been given me by the people I bought it from. I shined it, I polished it, I put a black background behind it, and you can hear the lectern is kind of black. I looked into it, and I saw in the future. I saw historians of the 22nd century looking back at all time with a certain sense of bemusement, if not of disbelief, wondering how this could have happened, that presumably intelligent people had all bought into the climate scare, the hysteria, that the entire second part of the 20th century, well, the last third of the 20th century, the first part of the 21st century, was governed by this grand narrative that the Earth was in great danger, what George Carlin was satirizing. And they wrote several books which I could actually see in this crystal ball, comparing the hysteria that raged in our time to what Norman Cohn was writing about in his book, The Pursuit of the Millennium, which is about the 14th century in Europe that had gone collectively mad. A century which believed that the world was coming to an end, which there were grand folk movements from one end of the continent to the other end of the continent, in which uncountable numbers of people died in hysteria, martyred themselves and so on, because they believed profoundly that the world was about to end. The pursuit of the millennium. It was no different in the 21st century, according to the historians. We were also in pursuit of the millennium. The millennium was now a left-wing utopian millennium, which would be characterized by statist control of not only of the private individual, of free market economics, and also of exchanges between nations of one sort or another, that it was a kind of religious phenomenon, in a way, a false religious phenomenon, because when you think about it, you have carbon singers paying carbon taxes as a way of buying indulgences from their pontifical superiors. You had climate models which have become the sacred texts of people who literally believed in them, even though these were, apocryphal. This didn't matter. So in this crystal ball, I saw the future referring back to the present moment. And at that point, I knew that although nobody has a lien on the truth as human beings, we can't really be sure of what constitutes the truth. And in that respect, the postmodernists are partially correct. But we can perhaps approach something that I've called a credible verisimilitude, which is to say as close to the truth as we can get, because the truth is asymptotic. It constantly, the truth about spiritual matters, about major things that perhaps we cannot control or capture or understand completely, the truth will always recede the closer that we approach it. This is the nature of truth. But we can approach it, and we can, with evidence, arrive at conclusions which may not be final, but which may be persuasive. The problem with global warming, that movement, as with many other such episodes today, is that the evidence is not consulted. So what I try to do in this particular book, of course, the crystal ball thing is kind of a joke, but at the same time, what my adversaries, our adversaries, or the climate, the people who follow the Hadley Climate Research Unit, or Michael Mann, or James Hansen, or Al Gore, or David Suzuki, or whatever. These people are as much a joke as this crystal ball. And really the point that I'm trying to say is that really what they're doing is looking into a crystal ball. I never had to look into a crystal ball. All I had to do was spend 2.5 years reading up on the matter. Now, I read everything that I could read, not only those who are skeptical of climate warming or of presumably the charring of the planet that is taking place